welcome back, Mike. Good to have you back on the podcast for another Hacka conversation.
Yeah, great to be back. Seems like we've tried to do this about 17 times, but we eventually always get there. So
Yeah. I think this is the first time where we've had multiple failed attempts. I think I no-showed you once. I stood you up on the time difference. A couple days ago, we had internet connectivity issues. So hopefully we can work our way through it today for this one. But we approach part 3 of this Romans conversation as basking in the Kansas City Chiefs dynasty. Officially
a dynasty.
Officially.
It
was already a dynasty in our minds. Yes. I've been joking with the guys here at POS because we got the fandom here is very random. It's like whenever you first started watching NFL, that becomes your team if they're good at that time. So you've got people who, like my pastor, he's a big fan of the Steelers.
Okay.
You've got people who are fans of the Giants. And they won a couple, and I feel bad for them because that was a short-lived experience there.
Downhill quickly.
That's like becoming a Royals fan. And I met a guy years ago at the batting cages here in Australia, and I think he was teaching his kids how to hit a ball or whatever. He's Aussie, and he's wearing a Royals hat. I was like, and remember, this is years ago. This isn't 2014, 2015. This is like 2010, 2011. I'm like, what are you? Where'd you get that hat? He goes, oh, that's my team. I was like, really? He goes, yeah. Really got into baseball like 1984, 85. I was like, ooh. So he had 1 year of joy and 30 years of misery.
Sorry about that, friend.
Yeah. Poor timing. But anyway, it's been fun. Some of these guys, they've been teasing me the whole journey. And I'm just like, guys, it's much more fun if you just join the bandwagon. Don't hate watch.
Just hop on. There's plenty of room.
There's plenty of room. There's no judgments here. We're happy for you to join.
And if there's not plenty of room, we'll kick all the Swifties off and you can jump on.
Hey. Don't you talk bad about my Swifties. No, it's been a lot of fun. We won't go too far into this because people will just get tired of us Kansas City guys talking about it, but we're very proud of our hometown and proud of the Chiefs.
Yes,
Another
sir.
championship under the belt. Yeah. Well, you're all here not to hear us talk about the Chiefs. You're here to see if we can discuss some things about Romans and see what we can learn together here today. This is part 3, so we've covered chapters 1 through 4 on the first part, chapter 5 through 8 on the second part. So if you missed those, go back and listen to them. They're very good. A lot of insight Mike shared with us. And today we're going to be discussing chapters 9 through 11. Now, that's not a mistake. It's not a typo. There's 4 parts to Romans, and they just decided that one of the parts, like for us type A people, it should be 4. But no, it's 4:3:5. And so this one will be a little bit shorter. We're discussing chapters 9 through 11. So, Mike, as we do with these Hacka conversations, would you mind laying the platform for what we're going to be discussing here today?
As we've talked about numerous times throughout this podcast already, you have to follow Paul's flow throughout the book of Romans. So if you look at it, the first 4 chapters go together really well, kind of form like a subsection. Then chapters 5 through 8 form another subsection. Chapters 9 through 11 basically talk about the same, or all have the same theme. And then chapters 12 through 16 are a different kind of subsection. But if you kind of take the aerial view, all of them run together very nicely, but Paul just makes different arguments in different places. So in chapters 9 through 11, his argument is primarily concerning the people of Israel. It's actually pretty interesting what he dives into, and there's probably no better expert in the New Testament on the people of Israel than Paul himself, having not just been an Israelite, but also a Pharisee of the Pharisees, which,
Right.
We tend to look at Pharisees as, those are the bad people who crucified Jesus. But the reality is that not all of them thought the same way. Just like any religious group you have, Pharisees there were certain Pharisees who thought certain ways. There's even some indication in John that there were religious leaders who actually believed in Jesus, but because of fear of their compatriots and the people who were around them, they didn't profess it openly. And so
Wasn't
it's not.
Nicodemus one of those?
Yeah, Nicodemus was probably one of them. There's seems to be enough evidence. If Nicodemus had not been a convert, it's hard to believe that John would have even written about him at all, much less spent an entire chapter talking about Jesus' conversation with him. But anyway, so it's not hard to believe that within the group of the Pharisees there would have been a small sect who would have believed in Jesus. Now we know Paul was not one of those, but it just kind of proves the point that not they didn't all think the same way. And so with Paul being a Pharisee of the Pharisees, he was probably part of the upper group, even within the Pharisees. So he would have been very learned, very knowledgeable in the Old Testament scriptures, and that's brings us back to chapters 9 through 11. He kind of does this breakdown of kind of what the past, present, and future of Israel kind of entail. So at the beginning of chapter 9, it kind of relates back to Romans chapter 2. If you remember right, in Romans chapter 2, we talked about how Paul says that the Jews had all of the advantages. They had the Torah, the law, they had the commandments, they had the prophets, they had all of these. They were visited by God himself. God came down from the mountain and visited with them. And so they had these incredibly profound experiences. And so Paul is saying that the people of Israel had all of these things, but what we have to remember, the key word in Romans chapter 9 is promise. That's what we have to remember, because he distinctly makes a difference between those who were born of the flesh and of Abraham and those who were born of the promise of Isaac. And so in Paul's worldview and his thinking is just because someone claimed to be an Israelite did not mean that they were a true Israelite. A true Israelite was someone who believed in the promise, who wasn't just a physical heir, a physical heir of sorry about that, a physical heir of Abraham, but someone who believed in the promise, who was of the faith of Abraham as well. And so that's why we see, I believe it's Romans chapter 4, where he really digs into Abraham and his faith and how he believed God, and he staggered not at the promise of God. He trusted God. And so his point in chapter 9 is that those people who receive the promise, or those people who have believed in the promise, are the people who are the true children of Abraham. And so that's very important to remember, because he makes this distinction between those two groups, and basically he has a conversation with himself. If you've ever read Romans chapter 9, it's kind of funny, because he'll ask a question, a rhetorical question, and then he'll answer it himself. And so it's kind of funny reading through it.
Sounds like me in Bible study.
Yeah, or me on any day.
But sometimes actually wanting an answer to the question.
Yeah.
What do you think? Crickets. Okay.
Moving on. All right. So he asks a couple questions in Romans chapter 9, and basically what he's getting at is he wants people to understand that although this selection process that God makes might seem to be unfair from the outside, it's completely fair, because those who, first of all, God is sovereign and can do whatever he wants. Now, again,
right.
We in this 21st century do not like that answer. It's like the parent saying, because I said so. Well, the kid's just going to still keep asking why. Well, why? And so that's our problem with it. But what you have to understand is comparing myself to God is no comparison whatsoever. God has more information than we do. He understands things on a level that we just don't understand. Hence the reason why he chose Jacob over Esau. And we see later in both Esau and Jacob's life that that was the right choice, right? We understand Jacob
Yeah, of
had his
course.
flaws for sure, but Jacob had more of a heart after God than Esau ever did. And so what we have to understand is that although it may appear from the outside to be random, it's never random with God. God always has a specific plan in mind. He always has a specific thought in mind, and he always knows what he is doing. And that's Paul's argument here in Romans chapter 9. Although from the outside, he even says, who are you to question God? Who are you to wonder about God? And he's not doing that to be malicious or to be hateful or spiteful, but it's an honest question. It's a true question. How can we, people who are created, think that we can fully grasp or fully understand the plan of the one who created us? It
Right.
would be like a computer system figuring out a person. That doesn't make any sense.
Mm.
The person created the
Well,
computer system.
it's sort of like a callback to God's conversation with Job when he
Yeah,
answers out of the whirlwind. He's like, "Where were you when I
exactly.
created the foundations of the world? Where were you when I did this?"
We weren't there when he created everything. You weren't. I mean, you were there in the womb when he created you, but you had no understanding. You had no
Mm.
thought process. You didn't understand what was going on. You simply, as a small child, trusted him. And then when you were
Right.
born, you trusted your parents. You believed that your parents were raising you correctly. You trusted them. And so that's what we have to understand with God. You don't see things from the angle or the perspective that he sees them from. And so it makes much more sense to trust him and to depend on him because in the end, he is always, always, always right.
Like think back to when you were a child. Like let's say you're 5, 6 years old, and back when you thought your parents knew absolutely everything, right? And so there was this trust there. There's this innate trust, especially if you had good parents. So let's make that the caveat. You had good
Yes.
parents
Yeah.
who were trustworthy, looked after you, so on. And like like I thought our dad was the smartest person in the world. He knew everything. If I
He
pointed at a
is. What are you
building,
talking about?
drive, yeah, you still think that way. Driving down the highway, pointed at a building, Dad, what's that? And expecting him to answer the question. Now I'm getting those questions from my kids. But think back to that thought process if you can get in touch with your younger self. Think about that, the way you viewed your parents, and then imagine the parents are actually all knowing, like
Right. Exactly.
knows everything. It's not someone who's an imposter trying to fake it. I had this running joke with Mia for years, my niece, that I knew every song. I said I know every song that's ever been written, because like I've got a pretty wide catalog of songs I do know. So chances are, like if it was a song popping up in like mainstream or whatever, I'd be able to hum along or whatever. And then she finally got smart enough, and she's just out of the blue. I told her this on her off day or something, and then out of the blue, there's a song playing. She's like, "Uncle, do you know this song?" I was like, she'd remembered. It's like sitting in the back of her head that I know every song. But think about that, like the way you viewed adults or the way you viewed your parents, and take that high view of God, but even higher, right? He knows everything.
Well, and that's
so that's the sovereignty of God.
that's what's so hard, right? We can't even imagine that.
Yeah, you
Think
can't
about the
grasp it. Yeah.
fact. I like your example. Take that understanding that you have your parents, but magnify it times. You almost have to magnify it times infinity, because
Yeah, infinite. Yeah.
we can't grasp that, and that's why we have such an issue with that answer from Paul. That's why we have such an issue, because we can't grasp that understanding that God understands things on a level that we simply do not understand them.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. So, and then, so he's going down through chapter 9, and chapter 9 actually ends with a bit of an ironic twist. I absolutely love this. If you read Paul, um, he has quite a bit of irony within his writings at certain points, and he kind of does it here at the end of chapter 9. He talks about how the Gentiles who did not have all of these things, right? They didn't have the Torah. They didn't have the experience with God on the mountain. They didn't have the prophets. They didn't have any of this stuff, but they believed. And in an ironic twist, the Jews who had all of those advantages did not believe. And so here again, he kind of asks himself a question, well, why is that? How is that possible? How is it possible that the people who have all of the advantages, the people who have everything going for them, cannot believe, but the people who are on the outside of all of this somehow are able to come to terms with Jesus as the Messiah? And his answer is simple. It's faith. They simply believed. That's all it is. The Jews rejected their Messiah and crucified him. The Gentiles heard the message, were converted in their minds and in their hearts, and followed faith. And that was the difference. That's the difference between the Jews and the Gentiles. That's it. It's not that Gentiles were more favored by God, because they weren't. It's not that Gentiles had more information, because they didn't. It's simply because Gentiles looked at what was being said, applied it, and lived it, and accepted Jesus, and decided to follow Jesus through faith. That's the only difference between the two groups.
Verse 30 of Romans chapter 9 is just striking, as you said, an ironic twist. He says, "What shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness," so they didn't pursue it. They weren't trying to be righteous. They attained righteousness, even the righteousness which is by faith. So it's like they weren't even in the pursuit of it, yet somehow they attained it. How did they do that? And as you just said, it was through their faith. They believed. And as you, I think it was you said chapter 4, right, where it was Abraham.
Yeah,
it talked about his faith was accounted to him as righteousness.
Yep. So in this ironic twist, Paul is actually connecting Abraham with the Gentiles.
Wow, yeah, that's amazing.
Because essentially what he's saying is the Gentiles who believe, obviously not all Gentiles, but the Gentiles who believe are the true children of Abraham, because they acted just like Abraham. Abraham wasn't justified because of circumcision. Paul makes that very clear. He was justified before that. He was justified through faith. And so because Abraham simply believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness, the people who followed Abraham, Jew or Gentile, it doesn't matter, Jew or Gentile, whoever believes in God through faith and is obedient to his will and to his purpose is a child of Abraham. And that is what is so striking about Romans chapter 9. It's incredibly powerful. And again, we're not going to be able to cover every single thought in this chapter. Again, I highly encourage whoever's listening to this podcast, read this, please read this for yourself, because you will see things that even we don't see. There will be things that pop out to you while you're reading that we may not see. It's an incredibly powerful, ironic twist that he does at the end of that chapter. And again, it's why Paul is my favorite writer in the entire Bible. And maybe I would argue through all of history, he's probably my favorite writer, because it's not just doctrinal points. He is brilliant with his discussions, with his debates. He's brilliant in getting his point across. And so he kind of
one more layer I wanted to add to that before you get more into it, is that he makes that connection in the further connection, and I think you highlighted a little bit earlier, saying that when you were talking about how that Israel had all these advantages, they had the advantages of the Torah, they had the advantages of the prophets, they had the advantages of the kings and the judges and all of these different things, the centuries of covenant relationship with Yahweh. They had all of these advantages, and yet the interesting thing is Abraham didn't have any of that. All he had was a relationship with God. He didn't have the law.
Yeah.
He didn't have the prophets. He didn't have, and much like Abraham, the Gentiles didn't have all of that.
Right.
But it was simply through faith, and that might have been apparent to a number of you already listening. I'm sure that was apparent to Mike. But I just felt like to open that up a little bit more, that point. The connection isn't just the faith question, but it's also he didn't have all these advantages as well, and the Gentiles didn't, and yet they were able to attain righteousness through their faith.
I think we forget that because we understand that Abraham was, quote unquote, the first Jew, the first Jewish man. We forget he technically was not a Jew because he didn't have all of those things. That's a very, very good point. And it takes me back to when Jesus is talking to the Jews in John, and he says that you claim to have Abraham as your father, but you don't do what Abraham did. And this is that's essentially what he's talking about there, is Abraham would have believed in me. If Abraham was alive today, he would have believed in me, is essentially what he's saying. But you don't believe in me, therefore you're not really children of Abraham. And
because Abraham had that simple faith.
Yes.
Like it wasn't a complex faith.
Right.
It wasn't something that required all these extra things, all of these extra commandments, all of these things that they needed to do, the sacrifices and all of these different things, ceremonial laws and so on. His faith was simple.
Right.
It was his relationship with God.
Right. And so, and that's why he pleased God in such an amazing way. God just said to do it, and he did it. It's remarkable to me. If you go back to the story in Genesis, where we just kind of bump into Abraham, right? Like he almost comes out of nowhere. We don't know who this Abraham character is. We've heard about him through the genealogy, but we don't know who he is. And the very first scene that we see Abraham is saying that God calls him out of his home and tells him to go to a foreign land. And so right from the beginning, the writer of Genesis is making it very apparent that Abraham had this understanding of God. We know that he had to have an understanding of God, because if some voice had just spoken to him and he didn't know who it was, it's very unlikely that he would have obeyed. So there's an indication there that he knew, he at least had some semblance of understanding of who God was. He says, okay, God, and he gets up and he leaves. Now, it's like he's leaving a home that he has established, a place where he has lived his life and settled down, and going to a place where he doesn't even know where he's going. Like it's not it's not like moving from my house in Kansas City to Philadelphia because I know where Philadelphia is at. It's like moving from Kansas City to some unknown location that God will reveal to me as I go along. I mean, it's remarkable what his faith was. And it's no wonder that Paul uses him as an example all throughout Romans.
Yeah, and he was well established. He already had wealth before he left, and he had a family. He didn't have children, but he had a family, and he followed a God he could not see.
Yep.
But it was a walk of faith.
Yeah.
All right. So let's continue on into chapters 10 and 11.
So chapters 10 through 11, I kind of blur them together. They kind of talk about the same thing. It's kind of Paul extending his argument. And so if you read Romans chapter 9, you think it's over for the Jews, right? If you by the time you get to the end of chapter 9, you're thinking, oh, well, it must clearly be over for the Jews. But he begins the next section by basically saying, no, it's not. And that's what his argument in chapters 10 through 11 is. He has this understanding that although most of the Jews rejected Jesus, first of all, not all of the Jews in Paul's day rejected Jesus. The early church at the very beginning was overwhelmingly Jewish. It was only Jewish at one point.
Yeah.
So, and it was thousands of people in the beginning, and they were all Jews. And so Paul seems to make this understanding that right there proves the Jews have not been rejected. They have not been fully rejected. But again, it goes back to his point in chapter 9. It's about faith. It's about promise. That's what this is about. It's not about whether you're a Jew or whether you're a Gentile. It's about faith and it's about promise. And he kind of continues that theme down through Romans chapters 10 through 11. And he starts talking about that actually the rejection of Israel, the temporary rejection of Israel, has opened the door for the Gentiles. So in this plan that God has had all the way from the beginning, it might seem like that the Jews have been rejected fully and that they're done, and it might seem like it's over for them. But what he wants his readers to understand is that that is not the case, and that in fact the Gentiles would not have the privileges that they have without the Jews. And I would make that same argument 2,000 years later. I don't see any reason to deride the Jewish faith. I think the Jewish faith, to a degree, is incomplete, obviously, because most of Judaism does not accept Jesus as the Messiah. So I would say that it's mostly incomplete. But Jesus himself was a Jew. Paul was a Jew. There's no distinction where Paul said, I moved from a Jew to a Christian. In his mind, they were the same thing. He was a Jewish Christian, or he was a Messianic Jew, is how he viewed himself. And so what we have to understand is that even though there is kind of this temporary kind of rejection because of the lack of faith overall of the Jewish people, there is also this understanding that God has not completely written them off, and he is not completely done with them yet. And we see that even today, 2,000 years later, there are still Messianic Jews out there. There are still people who practice Judaism who believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And so that's one part of it. But the other part of it that I find intriguing is that Paul makes the reference that it's actually the rejection of the Jewish people that has opened the door for the Gentiles. And so Paul himself kind of did this throughout his ministry. If you read the book of Acts, it says that he would actually go to the synagogue first. It was his practice to go to the synagogue. He would preach in the synagogue. And obviously in the synagogue, they were Jewish people. Gentiles were more than likely not allowed. But he would go to the synagogue, and then if the people in the synagogue would not listen to what he said, then he would go preach. And so he kind of follows this pattern that he's setting in Romans chapter 10 through 11. If the Jewish people aren't going to listen, then we're going to open up the door for the Gentiles. And then he kind of adds on to that by saying, but don't be haughty if you're a Gentile. Don't be proud if you're a Gentile. Because what you have to understand is, in the same way that the Jews were grafted out, you can also be grafted out. You can also be pulled off. Why? He goes back to this theme of faith. If you don't stand in faith, then you're going to be pulled out. If you don't stand by faith, be careful how you stand, because if you stand in pride, you will fall and you will be grafted out. If you stand in faith, you hold on to that faith that your forefather Abraham had, then is when you will be accepted. And so that's pretty much chapters 9 through 11. It's pretty remarkable, the stuff that's found within those chapters.
Yeah, and to touch on a couple of verses in chapter 10, and I'm just touching on them because they're some of my favorite scriptures, so I'm just being selfish here. But in Romans 10, where he's talking about how salvation comes, how it is that people are come to God in salvation through faith, and he's talking about, as you alluded to, that there's no distinction between Jew or Greek. He says this in verse 12. The same Lord is the Lord of all. And then he continues on and says, how, in verse 14, how will they call on him in whom they have not believed? How will they believe in him of whom they have not heard? How will they hear without a preacher? How will they preach unless they are sent?
Right.
And verse 16, however, they did not all heed the good news, for Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our report? So not everyone believe the good news. But in then verse 17, he says, okay, well, so this is how faith comes to be. Faith comes from hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. So the word of God goes out. Faith only happens when you hear the word and then you respond to the word. It's not just hearing the word. It's not just going to church, but you actually have to respond to it through faith. Sorry,
just
I
like Abraham
had to
did.
touch on those scriptures. Yeah. He heard the word of God, but he had to respond to it. And his response to that word was faith, right? He responded by faith, and then that was accounted to him for righteousness. So it's not enough just to be connected. And I'm sure he's writing to a lot of people who are connected to faith through their family. And again, we're probably talking to a lot of second and third generation Pentecostals now. You may have been raised in church, like Mike and I. We were raised in church. It's not enough just to be connected to the church through familial relationship. We're not. We've been dealing with this a bit with our church plant. We're not Pentecostal like a Baptist is a Baptist or a Catholic is a Catholic. We're Pentecostal through experience, our personal experience, not through our family experience, right?
Right.
And so the way that we grow in our faith is by hearing the word of God, but then also responding to it. The response is as necessary as hearing.
Yes. I mean, that's the problem I've always had with the just pray a simple prayer form of doctrine, because not to pick on anyone, but I'll say it nicely, any person can repeat after another person and pray a prayer. That doesn't require any bit of faith whatsoever. What does require faith is hearing that word and responding to it. And Jesus gives us an indication of this in the parable of the sower. It talks about the ground that each seed falls on, and it was where the seed grew was in the ground where people heard the word and they applied it and they lived it. And so even further still, even with the Pentecostal experience, you can hear the word, you can have the Pentecostal experience, but if you don't follow with the lifestyle, if you don't follow with obedience to God every single day, every day that Abraham woke up, he put himself in a position to hear from God and to respond to God and to obey God. And that's where
And
we
he
have
had
to put
many
ourselves.
opportunities not to.
Yes.
He had many opportunities not
He
to,
could have
right?
turned back
Like
at
when he
any
came,
time.
he could have turned back at any time. He had that moment of decision between him and Lot. He had many different opportunities to turn back. He had another opportunity when the Lord asked him to offer his son, and of course that would have caused a lot of conflict in his heart. He's like, "Well, I thought I knew who God was. Why is he asking for my child? He gave me this promise, and yet he's asking for it." And that's even like a callback to where he came from, where they served gods who the priests would offer babies to or humans to as a sacrifice. And so, maybe there's this conflict going on in his mind. Have I gotten this all wrong? Is this the same God that I just left? So on and so forth. And so he still had an opportunity there to respond or not. And he continued to walk in faith. He continued to trust God, put his faith in him. One of the things we highlight when we're teaching Bible studies, we teach a Bible study called Life Studies. And I just taught a lesson on Abraham, and we talk about the walk of faith. And we use this analogy. It's like you're in a dark room, and a tile has a bunch of floor tiles, and the tiles are lighting up one by one. And that's the walk of faith. God lights up one tile, you take a step. God lights up another tile, you take a step. You don't know exactly where you're going, here on earth, just like Abraham didn't, but you're continuing to trust God and walk in faith.
Yeah, I mean, that's the indication of being a Christian. It's not just claiming the title of Christian, it's actually living like a Christian. It's actually living how Christ lived. Christ is the ultimate example of this. Every day that Jesus woke up, he was putting himself in a position to hear from God and to respond to God. We think, of course, he was God in the flesh. He had a very, very real flesh that he had to fight. So you could sit there and say he was God in the flesh, but you better not forget about that in the flesh part, because he was still the writer of Hebrews says that he was tempted at all points like as we are, yet without sin. And it also says that he was subjected to human frailty. And so what we have to understand is that he battled a very real flesh battle just like we do. At any time, I'm convinced, at any time, Jesus could have said, you know what, I'm done with this, and walked away. And so by his obedience every single day.
Well, I mean, we see a moment, I guess, similar to that in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he's, hey, let this cup pass from me, and then obviously,
it's a very
decides to drink of the cup.
Very real battle throughout his life, and so what you have to understand is he's the ultimate example for us. So in the same way that every day he sought after and followed the will of God, that's what we should be doing. That's what defines the life of a Christian. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be offensive in any way whatsoever, but a one-time experience does not define your life as a Christian. It just doesn't. They're great. We want those experiences. We have to have those experiences. But that is not what defines you as a Christian. What defines you as a Christian is following the will and the purpose of God for your life every single day. Because if you just rely on experiences, you won't last very long. It's that simple. If you're just relying on an experience with God, you're not going to last very long. You have to have a commitment to faith, a commitment to suffer, as I believe we talked about in the last podcast. You've got to, and I know we don't like that word. I don't like that word. But the reality is that we have to have this commitment to everyday lifestyle, every single day, living how God wants us to live.
And so how does Paul in chapter 11, I'll give you a chance to finish this off.
I love this verse so much. He ends with, "Oh, the depth of the riches and the wisdom and knowledge of God. We cannot search his judgments. We cannot fathom his ways." Isn't that just the perfect ending to this section? It's like, I couldn't have written a better ending to a section where basically what he's talking about this entire time is how vast God is and how much he understands much more than we do. And because of that, we should live our lives in obedient faith to him, because that's what Abraham would do, and that's what any true believer in God would do. But he ends it with just this perfect exclamation. "Oh, the depth of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God. We can't search his judgments. We can't fathom his ways. We are lost without him." It harkens back to Job. You weren't there when I created all this stuff, when I made all this stuff. You can't understand on the level that I can understand. And that's why I can trust God every single day, because I know that he has information that I don't have. That's what makes it easy for me to live life as a Christian. It's not because the Christian life is easy, because it's not. It's not because I have everything figured out. It's not because I have all the information. It's because I take him at his word. And it's because I understand that if he really is God, then he understands things on a level that I don't understand them. And that may make other people afraid, but I love that. I don't want to serve a God who I understand everything about. He wouldn't be God. He would just be a friend or an acquaintance. But I don't understand everything about him, but that in a weird, ironic twist is why I can serve him.
I think that's a good place to stop there. I've really enjoyed this conversation on the third part of Romans. Hope you guys have been blessed by it. We hardly really touched on any specific passages except for that one passage in Romans 10 and a couple in Romans 9. So you can see how amazing this writing is, how full of wisdom, and there's such a depth to it. So really encourage you guys to dig into it, and catch us next time for part 4 of this conversation on the book of Romans.